What is it about the French? They seem to do things bigger, more flamboyant, more spectacular, more je ne sais quoi. Don't worry, that's only French I'm going to try and throw in here. More, if you will, French. When they protest, they go all out. Their government raises the retirement age, they take to the streets, flipping and burning cars, much like we do in the U.S. if our team wins the Super Bowl. So when they decide to kill a king, they'll make a show of it. Now, don't get me wrong, the English know regicide, just ask Charles I and Richard III, and the many residents of the Tower of London. And of course, for a while, killing emperors was the national pastime of the Roman Empire. But the French won't be outdone. Now, we're not looking at the death of Louis XVI, although that was a fun mess. We're going to go back a bit farther. The myths of the French Wars of Religion and the murders of King Henry III and Henry IV. And don't worry, there'll be plenty of other murders to go around. I'm Mick Biddick, and this is History is Criminal. In this episode, we're going to take a look at the French Wars of Religion and the deaths of not only two kings, but a handful of other nobles. Now, here in the U.S., we really don't look at this period of French history much. We hit the Reformation and the English Reformation and sometimes get wrapped up in the Tudors of England for a while, but we rarely look across the channel at that time. I taught world history for 30 years, and I don't think any book or curriculum I used ever talked about the French Wars of Religion. They might have in passing have said something about conflict between Catholics and Huguenots as part of the Reformation, but nothing like the detail they gave to the English conflicts. And while I know we can't cover everything in detail in a history class, trust me, I know that all too well, it's too bad because the conflicts in France are every bit as twisted and messy as anything Tudor or Stuart England had to offer. And you might want to take notes here because in true monarchical fashion, half the people in the story are named Henry. Or more likely Henri, because they're French, but I'm going to anglicize it for my own sanity. It's fair to say our story starts with the death of the king. Now, Henry III was never meant to be king. He was the fourth son of Henry II and Catherine de' Medici. Now, Henry II's death was a spectacular event. The unfortunate ending to a grand celebration. Henry and Catherine had just married off their daughter to the King of Spain. This would be a huge win for the Valois dynasty of France. The wedding, when combined with the treaty with Austria, and his friendship with King Edward VI of England, who had just made him a member of the Order of the Garter, would make France powerful and mostly safe from outside invasion. He would be able to turn his attention then to the persecution of the Huguenots, helping set the stage for what would become the French Wars of Religion. So, June 30th, 1559 was supposed to be a celebration of all the good things happening in France. Henry was an avid hunter and horseman and loved to take parts in the tournaments. He would naturally then join in the joust. Now understand, the joust was in no way scaled back just because you were the king. It was still two men in armor charging at each other on horseback with long poles. The goal, to knock each other off their horses. Not much different than two cars crashing together at 25 miles an hour. Routinely, bones would break, riders would get concussions, and sometimes worse. For Henry II, it would take a more violent turn. As the two horses crashed together, the lance of Gabriel Montgomery shattered. A shard pierced the visor of the king, passing through his eye and into his brain. So Henry II kind of got a brain shish kebab. Now, royal doctors did about the only thing could do in the 1550s, and they sat and waited. The wound, left untreated, caused an abscess in the brain, and the king died on the 10th of July, 1559, and the crown was passed to his sickly 15-year-old son, Francis II. Francis was King of Scotland due to his marriage with Queen Mary of Scots, in addition to his short reign as the King of France. The young queen had been living in France since she was 5 years old, until at 16 she married the 15-year-old Francis, whom she had basically been raised with. Now, Francis's reign would be short. Sickly and inexperienced, most of the power was actually handled by regents, including his mother, Catherine de' Medici. When Francis died, only 17 months in power, his younger brother, 10-year-old Charles, came to the throne. As for Mary, Queen of the Scots, she was, how we should say, politely encouraged to lead France. It would be during the 14-year-long reign of Charles that the French wars of religion would really heat up. These civil wars between French Catholics and Protestant Huguenots would rage for the next 36 years. Charles would try to settle things a little bit when he married his sister off to a leading Huguenot, Henry of Navarre. But influenced heavily by his devout Catholic mother, things turned nasty once again following the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Anything that ends in massacre probably doesn't settle things down. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572 was an organized attack and assassinations carried out against the Huguenots, likely on the orders of Catherine de' Medici and the king's brother Henry III. Now, all this while, Henry had been making a name for himself. In 1750, his brother, the king, had arranged for him to marry Elizabeth I of England. The marriage was not to be. Elizabeth was 37, 18 years older than Henry, although that really wouldn't make much of a difference in the arranged marriages of royalty. The real problem was that neither seemed to really like this idea. Elizabeth might have only been considering the idea as a way to bug Spain, who she was having serious problems with. And Henry, well, he publicly called Elizabeth a putain publique, or public whore. Needless to say, this was not a match made in heaven. Henry was also, just before this, in the confusing world of medieval Europe, elected the King of Poland. Now, I'm not going to get into this at all because it's weird and confusing and bears nothing to do with our story. Now, what is important, though, is he was also in charge of the French armies, at which point mainly involved the killing of Huguenots. So while his brother, King Charles IX, is trying to moderate his approach, Henry and his mother are a little more old school with the massacring and the warfare. Then Charles would come down with a serious case of death. The 30th May, 1574, Charles died from what most likely was tuberculosis, and Henry III became King of France. He had 3 older brothers. Each of them had died from illness, including, of course, Charles and his brother Louis, who had passed away at 1 year, 8 months. So it's safe to say that if things hadn't played out just right, Henry would have never ended up king. Now, with this in mind, Henry had been a bit of a rebel in his youth, even calling himself a, quote, little Huguenot, and only going to Catholic Mass to make his mother, Catherine de' Medici, happy. But like youthful rebellion often does, he would allow this to pass and would become a devout defender of the Catholic faith. Now, how truly devoted he was to the Catholic religion is a great question. But that's not the only question that comes up about young Henry. Rumors spread and were persistent throughout his life about his sexuality. Scholars debate this about him, some claiming he was, quote, very close, unquote, to some of his male courtiers. Others point to his famous mistresses. Now, while these scholars seem to want to be all or nothing, it's most likely he was bisexual. But it's also important to keep in mind here that the reason some people give for Henry and his boys having not been able to be gay is because they were great swordsmen who fought duels. Now, I'm not sure what that's got to do with their sexuality other than playing into the stereotype about effeminate homosexual men. But Henry was nonetheless full of contradictions. In 1576, he would take a conciliatory position with the Huguenots. This caused the Duke of Guise to form the Catholic League. The League had its goals to eradicate Protestants from France and remove Henry from the throne. So, Henry was forced to rescind his policies that favored the Huguenots. Then, the Valois dynasty took another hit. Henry's younger brother and heir, Francis, Duke of Anjou, died. This would mean that the Protestant Henry Navarre, remember, was married to Henry III's sister, was next in line to the throne. He was actually a descendant of Louis IX and had a distant claim to the throne. This would lead to what is called the War of the Three Henrys. Henry III of France, Henry Navarre, and Henry Lorraine, the Duke of Guise, because, as I said before, there were only like 5 or 6 names for nobility in the Middle Ages. This was, in fact, part of the French Wars of Religion, and was basically a fight over who would be named to follow Henry III. Spain had thrown their support behind the Duke of Guise, aka Henry Lorraine, but when the Spanish Armada was sunk in 1588, that support ended up not having a lot of bearing on things. France was a mess, and Henry III was about as popular as a Tesla at a monster truck show. While Guise was growing in both power and popularity. Guise's forces controlled a large chunk of France. Henry III had been expelled from Paris, and Guise's followers held the city. Guise, it seemed, held all the cards. Henry would have to consent to Guise's wishes. This was something Henry couldn't take, so he made plans to get rid of Guise. This was not an easy task. First, he had to get Guise to agree to meet with him. Second, he had to get Guise away from his guards, all while keeping his plan secret. Now, Guise was given plenty of warnings by people to stay away, so I'm not sure how well Henry had kept the secret, but Guise would step into the trap. He must have believed that Henry was about to make him heir to the crown when he and his brother, the Cardinal Guise, were called to meet the king. On the 23rd of December, the Guise brothers were called to a private council with the king. It was customary that bodyguards not attend private councils with the king, so the brothers entered Henry's chambers alone. But instead of meeting with the king, ready to hand over the keys of the kingdom, they were met by the king's guards. Guise attempted to defend himself, but was quickly overpowered and stabbed multiple times. At first, the plan was to spare the cardinal. They had some qualms about killing a religious leader. After all, Henry was still a Catholic himself, but after some debate, the decision was made. They had to kill the cardinal. He was butchered in the cell that he was being held with after the murder of his brother. Both bodies were burned to ash, and the ash spread to the winds. Then it was a matter of rounding up and jailing Guise's supporters. This, of course, was not without its own violence. Preachers across France began openly calling for Henry's assassination. Parliament charged the king with murder. This forced Henry to join forces with Henry of Navarre. The two marched on Paris with the plans of retaking the city. To give you an idea of what was going on, in an earlier battle, one of the guardsmen who had killed Guise himself had been killed. His body was then mutilated and his head put on a pike and displayed in Paris. This was a clear sign that the taking of Paris would be a bloody affair. Henry's army was in St. Cloud, just outside of Paris, in August of 1589. A Dominican friar named Jacques Clement used forged papers to get into the king's presence. Henry was informed the friar had an important message for him that was only meant for the king. Henry ordered his attendants to step back to allow for privacy. Clement leaned in close as if to whisper into the king's ear as he handed him a bundle of documents. Then he quickly pulled out a knife and plunged it into the king's abdomen. Clement stepped back and was instantly killed by the king's guards. At first, it looked as if the wounds were not fatal, but Henry called his officers to him and made each of them take a loyalty oath to Henry of Navarre. The next day, August 2nd, was the day scheduled for the launch of the attack on Paris, but the attack was postponed as Henry lay dying. He would die later that day, and as news of his death reached his army, it seemed to melt away. In Paris, the news caused massive celebrations, with many proclaiming it to be an act of divine providence. Henry would be buried in St. Denis Basilica. Dying without a legitimate heir allowed the crown to pass to Henry of Navarre, now Henry IV. It marked the end of the Valois dynasty and the start of the Bourbon line. But Henry IV stepped into a country that was engulfed in religious war, facing possible attacks from outside forces as well. Fighting would continue. Attempting to settle the matter, Henry would take a more middle ground and even converted to Catholicism himself in 1593, supposedly saying, quote, "Paris is well worth a mass," unquote. Just where Henry IV really stood on religion is anyone's guess. He had been baptized Catholic as a child, but raised by his Protestant mother, then renounced Protestantism in a belief that this would secure his crown. This caused the Huguenots to turn on him and end what was a growing alliance with Queen Elizabeth of England. It also didn't cause an end to violence. Later, Henry IV would have to pass the Edict of Nantes, granting rights to Protestants, though it would take years to restore order. In the meanwhile, Henry IV divorced his first wife, who was Henry III's sister, and married Maria de' Medici from the same powerful, very Catholic family as Catherine de' Medici, and the two started having babies. In 1609, a man named Francois Ravaillac entered an already messy story. Francois was a religious zealot who believed God had instructed him to kill Henry IV. Francois had actually been kicked out of a couple of monastic orders because of the wild visions he reported. So when Henry IV supported the Protestants in their war against the Habsburgs, starting a war against the Pope, Francois decided Henry had to die. Francois began to stalk the king. He would get lucky on the 14th of May, 1610. Henry IV was traveling across Paris in a carriage. Moving down a narrow street, he was held up when a hay wagon and a cart loaded with wine had difficulty passing each other, causing congestion. Think a 1610 traffic jam, but with horse-drawn carriages and carts. Henry IV lifted the leather curtain of his carriage to see what all the fuss was. This caused a crowd to gather. Henry IV was now popular and oftentimes being referred to as Henry the Great. So people wanted to get a look at the king. His footman then stepped away to try to disperse the crowd. Francois, who had been following the carriage, took advantage of the commotion and leapt forward. He stabbed the king twice, once under the arm, doing little damage, but the second hit the vena cava and aorta, the main arteries of the heart. The king was rushed back to the palace, but would bleed out. Francois made no attempt to flee. The crowd wanted to lynch him, but were prevented from doing so. He probably would have preferred that. Under questioning, which we can only assume was torture, it was determined that he had acted alone and was just simply a religious fanatic who, in a demented state, had decided he needed to kill the king. He was sentenced to death, but nothing as mundane as a simple hanging. First, his right hand, the one that had held the knife, was burned off with sulfur fire. Then a combination of molten lead, hot oil, melted wax, hot resin, and sulfur was poured over his body. Finally, horses were tied to each one of his limbs and made to charge in different directions, pulling his body apart. The pieces were then burned to ash and scattered in the wind. Henry IV's son, Louis XIII, would become king at the ripe old age of 9 and rule France for the next 42 years, until his death in 1643, most likely from tuberculosis. Though he died peaceful, his reign was dominated by the 30 Years' War and an attempted rebellion. It would be his son, Louis XIV, that would bring some stability to France during his 72-year reign. This has been History is Criminal. Hopefully you enjoyed all the regicide in French style. Come back in 2 weeks as we take a look at more crimes from the past. And if you don't mind, follow us on Spotify, Facebook, or Twitter, aka X. Until next time, thanks for listening.